Bringing it back to Putin and Russia and Trump more explicitly is obviously there's a lot of argument about the ownership, if you want to use that phrase, that Putin has over Trump. The fact that he was an agent of Krasnos, and this whole idea that Trump is somehow run by the Kremlin or is an asset. What's your take there?
Well, I encourage each responsible citizen to go out there and put the evidence together and see what they think for themselves, because there are some questions where you might need expertise. So, for instance, if we ask a question about the stability of the Chinese economy, that's not easy to work out for everybody. But a question like, is Trump a Russian agent, is something that any citizen can begin to responsibly look up on the internet and form a view about.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to The Global Gambit, where we cover a large proportion of the time Russia, Ukraine, Europe, and, well, NATO, that sphere of geopolitical issues. And one of the biggest elements that we are seeing as part of the Russo-Ukrainian war is the personal relationship between Trump and Putin. As I made a video just on this on October about the Budapest summit, not that we were surprised, being cancelled, it's now the case that Trump is slashing more sanctions onto Putin and the oil companies in Russia. But in this two-part conversation with a long-standing friend and guest of the channel is about, firstly, the relationship between Trump and Putin, and then the second half about Putin, the economy, and my guest's perspective. Because today my guest is Vlad Vexler, a philosopher and political analyst known for his reflective takes on power, morality, and many things Russia-related. And he is someone who, well, born in Moscow but now lives in London, like myself, is a mixture of sort of Western influence and Russian or Slavic influence, and who we've had on the channel before. Vlad, I'm delighted to have you back. Thank you for finding the time, given your personal circumstances. I guess my first question really in this whirlwind of what we're going to talk about is, how do you see the Trump and Putin relationship, given the bigger events that we've seen since, say, August in Alaska? We can get into specifics, but I'm interested for your initial thoughts.
It's a strange relationship because I think that on the one hand, Trump is inclined to ally with Putin ideologically. When I say that, I don't mean that they have some kind of conscious theory of politics that they're discussing and converging on. Ideology is a set of images, a set of beliefs, part beliefs that are semi-retreated into the subconscious. It's basically your map for negotiating politics.
Mm-hmm.
And these maps that these two folks have overlap quite significantly. I've discussed it a while ago on the main channel, making a claim that they share a kind of monarchist ideology with elements of might is right, which I label hyper-neoliberalism, and a strong element of fascization, although not a primary element. So that's one thing. Trump and Putin are at least partial ideological allies. That's not as strange as it seems, because there's a global ideology that's washing up on all of our shores. And in fact, I argue that Russia is just a very extreme case of the kind of ideology that's becoming organically prominent in the West too. So that's one component. A second component is that I make a claim that Trump has a personality challenge, a personality disorder, which I label narcissism. And one of the most important things to understand in Trump's relationship with Putin is that he experiences Putin as a source of narcissistic supply. He idealizes Putin and then admits himself and Putin into a fantasy society of which the two of them together are privileged members. That's not unique. Trump relates to other world leaders like that to a degree. Some of the same happens with Netanyahu, but it's quite an extreme with Trump and Putin. Trump enormously depends on aligning himself with a fictional image of Putin that he internalizes. So that's the two things that are drawing Trump toward Putin: ideology and narcissism. At the same time, Trump is the president of the United States, and he is sitting with all kinds of structural pressures and structural interests that make him act like a foe of Russia's.
Mm.
So if you asked me to summarize, I would say that Trump is a partial ally and partial reluctant foe of Putin. The reluctance largely comes not from Trump's own personality, but from his political predicament. He's got to deal with his own political system. He's also got to deal with the Europe that's trying to pressure him to do something in favor of Ukraine and against the Russians. Dispositionally, he is more inclined to let himself swim around in the ideological and narcissistic bonds with Putin. Practically, he's often pushed to take steps against Putin's interest, but this conflictedness is part of reality. There is no contradiction in us naming it. So that's how I'd label that relationship.
Okay, so a lot there to unpick, and I think the first thing that comes to mind when I think about this, which I mean, I've done political philosophy and think about it to a degree of philosophical thinking, but to my mind, it's largely Trump idolizes the strongman tendencies that Putin, President Xi Jinping of China, I mean, even North Korea's Kim Jong-un, they exhibit, right? And what's he want to do? He wants to replicate those sorts of systems as much as he can in the United States, which is why Hungary, and this is where I want to lead to the next question, is about why Hungary? Because Viktor Orban is the leader of an illiberal democracy. He has created a state within the EU, which, as you say, is standing up for human rights, rule of law, democracy, or liberal democracy. But Orban is trying to undermine as much as he can, still within the mechanisms that exist within the nation state of Hungary, though. Do you think that that's something that Trump would like to replicate and by extension, therefore, get more close with Putin's style of governance?
I think that in practice, that's where we're heading, but probably not under Trump and probably not even under Trumpism. That's the risk that we face in the 2030s. But it seems to me that Trump is less rather than more likely to do the level of damage we've seen done to democracy in Hungary, whereby you can sit around and genuinely ask, is it now even at all possible to get these guys out of power? The degree of asphyxiation of various kinds of institutions is, of course, different in Hungary to what it is in the United States, but the trend is very similar. We're seeing a systematic attack on counter-majoritarian institutions, from media to the academy. We're heading there, but we're just in a cultural moment in which our democratic cultures are weaker than our institutional resilience. That's also not that strong, but it's stronger than our democratic cultures, particularly in a very toxic and polarized United States. So the reality is we're partly depending on Trump grating against the materials of our democratic structures and them holding out for a while, probably holding out long enough to wait Trump out. But the trend is absolutely right. The United States, to put it cartoonishly, is heading for a Hungary predicament, all other things being equal. The central thing that could stop this is a very serious project of civic engagement and political transformation from the Democrats. If that comes, you could begin to partially reverse the trend implying would otherwise be inevitable.
No, certainly. I mean, from what I remember and now see from friends and my time living in the US, 5+ years, the Democrats have never been more in disarray, whilst the Republican Party does have, well, it's the Trump party, but there are plenty of older school, if you want to call them now, traditional Republicans who don't support Trump. But equally, they don't have a third candidate like a Mitt Romney or a more central, traditional conservative type. And so this leads us to a real problem for the US. But just to sort of change it slightly, how much do you think that the developments between Trump, Putin, and the overall direction of populism is about this argument that actually more centralized power is better for economic stability? Right? It's the argument that, on one side we've got liberal democracy, freedom of expression and choice, but it's more unpredictable versus a more centralized command structure. People don't mind being governed by a more semi-autocratic government if it means that their prospects economically, etc., are better.
I don't think most citizens in most Western countries, even most US citizens, would say yes if you just asked them, would you like a much more authoritarian government?
No, probably not questioning. But
I think that we're also not being silly when we say they might still vote for one, and they might still support one, and they might still normalize the existence of one. And that's really what we're talking about by this weird term that I mentioned earlier, ideology. It's a silly term because people often mean different things by it, and I confuse people as much as I help people when I mention it. But the reason I mention it is that if you think of ideology as something that's a little bit less tangible than just a set of explicit propositional claims you make about how you want to organize your politics, organize your economy. If you think of it as a kind of semi-conscious map people use to practically guide themselves through the political world, then you can understand absolutely how millions of people can be walking toward authoritarianism while still answering questions which say, do you want authoritarianism? By saying, no, I don't. So I think you're right that an element of this global wash that I mentioned, of an ideological kind, is something like the idea that might is right. Something like the idea that it's not just inevitable that the stronger party should win, but that's a kind of version of normal. And that we are only now coming out of a contingent and rather pathetic period of liberal privilege, at least in the West, where it was temporarily thought that this wasn't so. But in fact, once we properly reflect on reality, we'll see that it's appropriate for the stronger party to win. Obviously, that's an ideology we should oppose, but I think it's enormously influential in our culture. In other words, people in our culture are walking around increasingly half believing this, increasingly having images in their heads which normalize this. And quite rightly, we can also say that's compatible with them when consciously and directly asked about it, still saying no. But, people, if we ask them about whether they want extreme authoritarianism under the Nazis or under Stalinism, will often have still said, no, we don't, and we don't have it.
Okay. And, this makes me think a lot about just generally the views of the West more broadly. As you say, the past 80 years with the UN and all this idea of multilateralism, rule of law, seems like it's actually more of the anomaly than it is the normality. In the sense of might is right is back, and that we are seeing bigger states feel that they can just dictate to smaller ones the terms of everything. Trump likes to claim that he has achieved, what is it, 6 or is it 20? I have no idea. Peace deals now. I'm being slightly facetious, audience, but my point being, Trump has helped to negotiate ceasefires with Azerbaijan and Armenia, but basically through effective coercion, right?
I think it's
subtly said things.
Azerbaijan and Albania.
Oh, yes, that's the one. Yes, of course. Sorry, my bad, everyone. Yes, it was actually Albania and New Zealand. I think it was. But yeah, how much do you agree with that? That Trump's view of this is just might is right, that the use of coercion, even coercive diplomacy, as we're seeing with Venezuela, is just the new normal, or effectively a return to the older 1800s.
It's not clear to Trump why there should be impediments to his power, and he's frustrated by them. He doesn't really see the point in them. So Trump is much closer to Putin in this ideological sense of not really getting what a relation of political opposition is. If you're stopping me, you're probably a political enemy, not my opponent. A relation of political opposition is a relation where you and I play a game of tennis and we try to beat each other within the rules. If I start throwing balls at your head, trying to whack you with the racket, then I have gone beyond trying to beat you within the rules of the game, which is a way of trying to beat you while cooperating with you. So I don't believe Trump believes in relations of political opposition. I think they're just imposed on him by the fact that the US political system still has enough checks and balances to keep him in place. So I think that he is practicing relations of political opposition because he has to, but he's not an actor who is committed to them if you disinhibit what he is allowed to do. Here, I think the 20th century left would have a chance of whacking us on the head really badly by pointing out that while we are lamenting the decline and the predictability of US power was also a very mixed bag in the 20th century, projecting its imperialism in a malign and in a benign way in different contexts. So we do have to admit that we in the West have not stuck to our own principles. We've not stuck to our own ideas of sovereignty, of international norms. We have chosen to violate them when it's been convenient to us or ideologically compelling. That is not the central cause of what's gone wrong, but it's certainly part of the story. So it's not that we have moved from a remarkably benign projection of US power across the globe and from a history of European powers acting in conjunction with the best kinds of international norms that arose as part of the post-World War II jurisprudential revolution in international affairs. We ourselves have a very mixed bag. We ourselves did really weird stuff, for example, in Iraq, that makes us look very weak when we criticize Netanyahu or Putin. But nevertheless, the point is that for all of the flaws of US foreign policy historically, what we are witnessing is an unprecedented level of calamitousness, an unprecedented level of malignity. Just look at the diffuse humanitarian crisis that the cutting of USAID caused a while ago. And we're looking at an unbelievable degree of unpredictability. The United States is the central unpredictable actor in the world today, in the sense that it's just so powerful and people depend on it, and yet they don't know what it's going to do 6 months from now. So for all of the flaws of previous Western power, this is much, 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 much worse. And what's worse on the international stage is accompanied by and caused by deterioration in the state of Western democracy. I mean, what you've got in the United States now is a level of domestic political crisis and a series of authoritarian turns that basically undermine US capacity to act coherently in any kind of way on the international stage. So there's a kind of a folding away of predictable US power projection, benign or malign, indeed, in virtue of the democratic instability that the Trump administration is causing. Not to say that the Trump administration is, as it were, something that's come out of the blue, and that if Trump didn't exist, things would be going well for US democracy. They wouldn't. Trump's the result of causes and social forces that have brought him to power. But nevertheless, that's, I think, some of how I think about this.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot about the left to the right, and obviously some people argue that it's too simplistic, but going with it for the time being, because, well, it's the best that we have right now in ideological discussion, is the idea of the Overton window. For people who aren't familiar, this is the idea that what used to be radical can over time become normalized if there's enough exposure to it or something. And the Overton window has shifted so much because of the result of Trump, because of Brexit, because of the prevailing trends of populism in the Western world, particularly. How much do you think that those sorts of shifts are reflective of how Trump and Putin's relationship has evolved?
Well, let me ask you a question just to clarify. Do you mean a shift in the Overton window of how citizens see what they find normal, or perhaps relatedly, how much governments get away with that might seem normal now but wouldn't have seemed normal 5 years ago?
More the latter, that the fact that Trump has come in and he has shaken so much up in the past decade, which has obviously had an impact on the relationship of himself to Putin, but also the broader US-Russo relationship, right?
I think that disinhibiting dynamics are very important in political cultures. It's not just that we feel that we shouldn't do or shouldn't say certain things, it shouldn't even raise certain questions. Raising certain questions is itself enormously politically toxic. Even raising the question of, what if I confiscate territory from a neighbor? What if I confiscate territory from Canada? Just raising that question has a very toxic disinhibiting effect of, quite frankly, promoting the normalization of a kind of might is right. If I can do this, I'm entitled to do this kind of approach to political questions. And I think that one of the dangers we're facing is that once you raise certain questions or do certain things that you're not supposed to do, there is no going back, no matter who follows. So, if you and I continue doing this broadcast, but, we progressively started setting our hair on fire or taking off our clothes, and then other content creators started modeling us, there'd be a kind of a disinhibiting effect whereby people would lose a sense of what is a proportionate way of presenting a show on the internet. So this is very, very bad. And language, disinhibiting language in of itself is politically transformational. Much of the damage Trump does is just at the level of disinhibiting language. I'm going to, invade this country, or I'm going to challenge this country's territorial integrity. I'm going to do something very, very nasty to our allies. Once you say that you're going to do something very nasty to your allies, or once you put them in a difficult tariffs dilemma, there's no way of going back, because they are permanently going to remain in a position of thinking we have now left a historical period where we can relate to US power as being predictable and reliable. Don't forget, a lot of what keeps domestic democracies on the road isn't law and regulation, it's norms and rituals. And once you desacralize them sufficiently, it's much easier to start having thoughts like, well, why not tilt an election a little bit one way or the other? After all, one of the sides should be the side that wins. So let's just tally it up a little bit in their favor. I mean, why not? What's so bad about it? Let's just do it by 5%. Once you begin raising questions like that, there's really no going back. And there's a kind of self-perpetuating degradation of norms that we're engaged in. And much the same is happening in our debate. I mean, you and I are spending a lot of time deeply engaged on the different platforms on the internet, and we can see the broadening of windows of various kinds of debate and a normalization of claims and ways of thinking that are arguably destructive, but that don't generate a strong reaction from people anymore because of this toxic dynamic of disinhibition. So that's just one concept to throw in answer to your question. But I think we're dealing through a lot of disinhibiting dynamics. At the same time, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't be open to challenging ourselves and saying, well, look, maybe we did assume that certain debates were settled which aren't settled. We should be open to this. And in fact, one way of keeping democracy is to be open to this to a point. For example, take the issue of immigration. It's clear that whatever commitment you have to human rights, to compassion, to a non-cruel, progressive immigration policy, we've reached a legitimacy crisis whereby the immigration policies of most Western democracies are not perceived as remotely okay by large majorities or small minorities of the population. And here we can't just say they're racist or irrational. We actually have to say, if citizens responsibly and consistently feel this, we need to take this very, very seriously, because if we simply tell them to wise up and shut up, they're going to vote us out of power, and they're going to vote in progressively fascistized political actors who are actually simply going to put our democratic institutions to an end. So we have to balance this extreme danger of disinhibiting ourselves out of any sense of norms and proportion, with the fact that we do need to be much more open about what actually does need to be debated relative to where we were 10 years ago.
Certainly, and as a demographer, I go into the demographics and particularly the migration debate. Well, my dissertation was all about that, so I certainly resonate with much of what you said there. But bringing it back to Putin and Russia and Trump more explicitly, is obviously there's a lot of argument about the ownership, if you want to use that phrase, that Putin has over Trump. The fact that he was an agent of Krasnos, and this whole idea that Trump is somehow run by the Kremlin or is an asset. What's your take there on this conspiracy, if you want to say?
Well, I encourage each responsible citizen to go out there and put the evidence together and see what they think for themselves, because there are some questions where you might need expertise. So, for instance, if we ask a question about the stability of the Chinese economy, that's not easy to work out for everybody. But a question like, is Trump a Russian agent, is something that any citizen can begin to responsibly look up on the internet and form a view about. I can tell you mine. There's very little evidence for it that we can take seriously. But a way of thinking about it that I recommend but don't want to impose, because I want people to think for themselves about this, is that if you have a degree of expertise on Russian politics, you will very rapidly see that it's not true. Because in the Kremlin, they are always nervous about the next thing that Trump is going to do. They're always concerned that Trump's advances are going to be flipped on their head and something bad will happen. They are traumatized by what they perceive as a disproportionate degree of hawkishness in Trump's first term relative to Obama, relative to what came before. The Russians absolutely do not feel like they own Trump at all. In fact, they see Trump as a very scarily unpredictable actor who is, in broad historical terms, going to end up working in their favor on balance, but they're intimidated by the unpredictability. And they're also, I think, disappointed in Trump's weakness. They do recognize the ideological affinity. They do realize that there's a degree of fancy that Trump has for Putin. They wouldn't quite conceptualize it with this jargon of narcissistic dependence that I use. They do see that, but then they worry that Trump is too erratic, too weak, too unsteady, too impulsive to challenge US institutions as much as he could challenge them if he actually had the discipline of Orban or Putin. So Trump is ill-disciplined, unpredictable. He's done very mean things to us before, but broadly speaking, he is a guy who is going to undermine what we think are anyway bogus democratic institutions in the United States. When that happens, that's going to favor us because of how that'll make the United States act on the international stage. So Trump's a favorable actor, but they treat him with enormous concern, enormous apprehension, and a sort of a sense of puzzlement. On the one hand, he seems to be doing the sorts of things that Russia would like a Western politician to do, break counter-majoritarian checks and balances in democracy. On the other hand, he has acted harshly against Russia before. He doesn't seem to have a clear position. He says one thing one week, another thing another. We don't know what to make of him, and they really approach him with a pair of pliers. Putin does not have a reverse crush on Trump, a reciprocal crush on Trump. Trump's crush on Putin is one way. Putin doesn't know what to make of Trump. He is a little bit enamored that an institution as powerful as the US presidency is finally a little bit positively disposed to him. Putin does like that, and that does massage his ego nicely. But fundamentally, he finds Trump unpredictable. He finds the pressures that Trump is under domestically and constraints he's under domestically unpredictable. And he also finds Trump to be a weak idiot. Who can't be relied on. So mostly the Kremlin go around thinking, this is good for us, but also, damn it, we have to deal with this unpredictable moron who is difficult to deal with.
I like that. I think the phrase mindful idiot sums up the first part of our conversation quite well, Vlad. But if people want to know a bit more about what I think, or what you think the end game looks like, and also the state of the economy from Putin's perspective, they'll have to join us for part 2. We'll see you then, everyone. A speculation about Putin's state of mind or how he approaches the relationship with Trump. And Obviously, it's more, well, people will simply say that it's puppetry, that he manipulates Trump's own ego and ability to sort of, Trump's hunger for some kind of result is how the Putin's regime sort of approaches it. Would you agree with that, or is there a bit more to it? Because personally, I think there always is.
I think we shouldn't underestimate the incompetence of the Putin regime. I think that the Trump administration is enormously incompetent. I think the European powers are enormously incompetent. Not because the actors at the top are incompetent, but because we are in so much democratic stasis. And that's why you so often get embarrassing moments where European leaders talk but don't act.